Republican Convention and your guest. That was certainly some welcome. And I am most grateful to you for it. It'll be a matter of long remembrance to me.
For more than half a century, this American built a distinguished record of service to his nation. Yet, ironically, this President of the United States will inevitably be remembered because he led his country at a time of national calamity, the Great Depression of the 1930s. His name is Herbert Hoover, and this is his biography. This is Biography. Our story, Herbert Hoover. During his years in the White House, wrote one historian, Herbert Hoover was a reluctant politician. And Hoover himself admitted that he had little taste for the intrigue and infighting demanded of a politician. At other callings, Hoover said, men can make a living with far more satisfaction and many less wounds to the soul. November 1928. Herbert Hoover boards the battleship Maryland for a goodwill cruise to South America. As President-elect of the United States, this is Hoover's first official act, another spectacle of the carefree 1920s. For Herbert Hoover, this voyage marks the beginning of his term as president. 4 years that will cast a shadow over the accomplishments of a lifetime. Herbert Clark Hoover is born in the small town of West Branch, Iowa, during the summer of 1874. But when he is 8 years old, his mother dies, and he is sent to live with relatives in the Quaker settlement of Newburgh, Oregon. By the time he's 17, Hoover has decided on mine engineering as a career, and he passes up a Quaker college scholarship in favor of entering the newly founded Stanford University. Hoover devotes most of his energies to the study of geology and virtually ignores his other subjects. He also helps to organize a campus group called the Barbarians. They launch a crusade against the snobbishness of the exclusive Stanford fraternities. In his senior year, he leads the Barbarian ticket that defeats the fraternity bloc in the school elections. Hoover becomes the first non-fraternity man to hold a school office at Stanford. 1895, Herbert Hoover strikes out on his own for the gold fields of California. The roughneck mining business, however, offers graduate engineers little opportunity. Hoover works for $2 a day, pushing ore buckets through mine shafts. On the basis of his record at Stanford, Hoover lands a job with a British mining firm. For 2 years, he will work in Australia, introducing American gold mining techniques. Following his marriage to Lou Henry in 1899, Hoover travels throughout the world. During the next 15 years, he establishes an international reputation as a great doctor of sick mining companies. A hard-driving businessman, as well as a brilliant engineer, he soon heads a worldwide mining enterprise. Herbert Hoover is now a wealthy man, a living image of the Horatio Alger legend. August 1914, Thousands of American tourists find themselves stranded overseas as World War I convulses Europe. Herbert Hoover, one of the most influential men on the continent, is asked by the United States government to take charge of evacuating these American citizens. During the frantic weeks that follow, over 100,000 people are brought back home under his direction. The American ambassador to England writes, Herbert Hoover began his career in California, and he will end it in heaven, and he doesn't want any thanks. In 1917, when the United States enters World War I, Hoover comes home to assume the post of National Food Administrator. He urges millions of Americans to cut down on waste, to serve just enough. Food, he says, will win the war. And Hooverizing the family menu becomes a national pastime. After the armistice, Herbert Hoover returns to Europe and is appointed sole director of European Relief and Rehabilitation. Blunt, direct, and impatient, Hoover ruffles foreign tempers. Tact, says Britain's Lloyd George, is not one of his many great qualities. But Hoover is more concerned with getting his job done. Millions of people are starving, he declares, and they shall be fed. Again in the United States, Hoover is surprised to find that he has become a renowned figure, admired and hailed for his humanitarian mission in Europe. Stanford's most famous graduate now returns to the campus at Palo Alto to build a new house for his family. Hoover feels that his public service career is over. I will answer no phone calls, he says, nor read my mail. I am spending a month with 2 vigorous sons. Hoover's so-called retirement at Palo Alto ends in 1921, when President Warren Harding offers him a cabinet post as Secretary of Commerce. And he continues to serve under President Calvin Coolidge. He is a diligent and unobtrusive member of the administration. Spring 1927. Devastating floods sweep through the lower Mississippi Valley. More than 500,000 people are homeless. An emergency relief program. Marshaling men and supplies and food, Hoover again proves he is at his best when quick and decisive action is necessary. Has been looking forward to continuing his cabinet duties under President Coolidge and then, perhaps, retiring from public life. But his future is suddenly changed by Calvin Coolidge himself. The president says, I do not choose to run for president in 1928. Within an hour, writes Hoover, newsmen were demanding that I announce my presidential candidacy. Though he has never held an elective office, Herbert Hoover must now answer the call of the Republican Party. They tell him he is the people's choice for President of the United States. Hoover formally accepts his nomination at his beloved Stanford University. Although quiet, reserved, totally inexperienced in partisan battling, Herbert Hoover becomes the idol of millions of voters. Says one observer, the great engineer is literally being propelled into the presidency. statewide vote for Hoover is the greatest in the history of national elections. We'll be back with the second half of Biography in a moment. Inauguration Day, 1929. Calvin Coolidge proudly escorts his successor, Herbert Hoover, to the formal ceremonies at the Capitol. President-elect will begin his term of office at the height of the so-called New Economic Era, a time of booming optimism.
If we survey the situation of our nation, both at home and abroad, we find many satisfactions. We have emerged from the losses of the Great War and the reconstruction following it with increased virility and strength. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope.
Privately, however, the new president voices growing concern for the nation's spiraling economy. The people, he writes, have been mesmerized by the idea of stock speculation as the basis of national progress. Since 1927, prices on the New York Stock Exchange have been soaring. But Hoover refuses to ask for legislation that will curb the nation's stock buying spree. He declares that the federal government does not have the power to regulate stock buying. October 1929. After weeks of wild price fluctuation, panic sweeps Wall Street. Prices plummet as a wave of frantic selling grips and newspapers demand that the president make a statement on the crisis. Hoover delivers only a declaration of faith in the American economy. He calls the market crash a mild domestic readjustment, a passing trial. The economy reacts, however, like a house of sand. It begins to crumble in the wake of the Wall Street collapse. Within a month, the unemployment problem has become a major crisis. Hoover calls on industry not to lay off employees. He asks for federal work projects to help take up the slack.
And therefore I would say to the American public, be patient, be helpful, recognize the complexity and the difficulty of the problem before these servants of your combined public interest.
In speech after speech, the president tries to inspire confidence in a badly frightened nation. But his talks miss the mark. They are filled with technical details and delivered in a flat, emotionless tone of voice. He lacks the fire, the color that might cause the nation to rally round him. For more than a year, the business decline continues. Increasingly, Hoover himself is being blamed for the Depression. June 1932. 1 out of every 4 men in the United States is without a job. A total of more than 12 million are unemployed. In desperation, an army of World War I veterans from all over the country descends on Washington. They demand cash payment of a service bonus not due for yet another 14 years. The bonus marchers threaten to remain in the Capitol until the government makes payment. Despite a mob of 20,000 veterans milling around the Capitol steps, the Congress refuses to pass the bonus bill. Instead, the veterans are told they can have rail fare home. More than half of them accept the offer. Almost 7,000 veterans, however, remain in Washington, living with their families in makeshift camps. We have, they say, no place to go. Among the veterans are a handful of communists, crackpots and radicals hoping to stir discontent, to turn demonstrations into riots. Two bonus marchers are killed. A score of policemen are injured in the first outburst. When Washington police lose control of the situation, Hoover calls in federal troops. He tells General Douglas MacArthur to restore order in the capital, to drive the rioters out of the city. The bonus marchers are submissive. Not one shot is fired. Many newspapers attack Hoover for using federal troops. One often repeated charge is that Hoover is responsible for murdering war veterans in the streets of Washington. In the wake of the controversial bonus march, Herbert Hoover begins his 1932 presidential campaign.
Whether in the majority or in the minority, the Republican Party should and will continue to give its constructive service to the country. And it will return to power.
The opposition, headed by Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, blames Hoover not only for the Depression in the United States, but for the worldwide economic disaster.
My concern in dealing with the problems of these times, while fighting to save our people from chaos and to restore order in our economic life, has been to avert hunger or cold amongst those upon whom the blows have fallen with heartbreaking severity. That is our unemployed workers.
Now, let's be frank. Present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do.
Should my countrymen again place upon me the responsibilities of this high office, I shall carry forward the work of reconstruction. I shall hope long before another 4 years have passed to see the world prosperous and at peace in every American home, again in the sunshine of genuine progress and of genuine prosperity. This is my pledge to the nation and my pledge to the Almighty God.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Roosevelt wins the election by a landslide vote. Says Hoover, defeat was not unexpected. Democracy is not a polite employer, he writes. The only way out of office is to get sick, or die, or get kicked out. A heartsick and exhausted Herbert Hoover joins Roosevelt for the ride to the formal ceremony. Roosevelt's refusal to support Hoover's last-ditch efforts to stem the nation's crisis has embittered the outgoing president. Ex-President Hoover returns to his home at Palo Alto. I thank Providence, he tells one reporter, that I'm here in California. Herbert Hoover confesses a great sense of relief. I am emancipated, he says, from a sort of peonage. It is a release not alone from political pressures, but from the routines of 12 to 14 hours of work, 7 days a week. But even now, he is planning a lifelong crusade in which he will seek to vindicate his own administration while criticizing Roosevelt and the New Deal.
And I would be glad if thinking American people would soberly consider if the Republican elephant, even though he has made a multitude of mistakes, is not far more sure-footed towards recovery and progress than the bounding white rabbits of the New Deal. I recommend that magician's animal as the symbol of the New Deal party. It travels in uncertain directions at very high speed, and it multiplies rapidly.
Herbert Hoover continues to be an insistent, outspoken critic of FDR and the New Deal throughout the remainder of the Depression. When the United States enters the Second World War, Hoover's administrative experience is virtually ignored. Roosevelt refuses to offer him a government post. Gradually, through the war years, Hoover becomes an almost forgotten figure. After the Second World War, Hoover, in his 70s, finds that public opinion has begun to change. It has become obvious to a new generation that no one man should be held responsible for the Great Depression. That once it started, no one man could have stopped the 1929 economic pyramid from crumbling. In 1946, Hoover is asked to return to public service for the first time in 13 years. President Truman requests that he once again frame a worldwide program to help people left homeless or hungry in the wake of war.
Along the 35,000 miles that we have traveled, I have seen with my own eyes the grimmest specter of famine in all the history of this world. If every source of supplies will do its utmost, we can pull the world through this most dangerous crisis. The saving of these human lives is far more than an economic necessity to the recovery of the world. It is more than the only path to order, or the only path to stability and to peace, because such action marks the return of the lamp of compassion on this earth. And that is a part of the moral and the spiritual reconstruction of the world.
In his 80s, Herbert Hoover refuses to give up an active life. Those who retire, he says, can spend their time only talking about their ills and pills. Under President Eisenhower, as he had under the Truman administration, Hoover heads a commission to suggest changes in the organization of the executive branch of the government. In 1954, Hoover answers Konrad Adenauer's invitation to come to West Germany. In Bonn, the American elder statesman is hailed for his unselfish relief work throughout Europe. He is honored as a man whose constant aim is to serve humanity. Says Hoover, "Mine has been a long life, and in that time I have lived and worked among more than 50 nations. I have not visited them as a tourist," he says. "I have played a part in the lives of their people." In 1921, Herbert Hoover was offered a partnership in a colossal mining empire, a position that could have made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. But because he had also been offered a government post, he asked if he might have a week to think it over. Years later, Hoover wrote, "From the viewpoint of an untroubled life, there is no doubt that I made the wrong decision." Mike Wallace for Biography.